I love that the dream aspect of Penacony is really pulling no punches when it comes to interesting uses of the dream context. He exposits to such an insane degree that it might actually end up being an arc-ruining conversation. Star Rail 2.1 story has a lot going on and it needs to be talked about. But first, I need to make a confession. This may be the most conflicted I've ever felt about a Star Rail chapter yet. But you know what you shouldn't feel conflicted about? Subscribe! Hoyoverse never listens in Genshin Impact. And I say this as somebody that was asking for extra in-game in Genshin for 27 years. Hoyoverse does listen sometimes when it comes to Star Rail though. And with this most recent change, you can thank me in the comments because Hoyoverse has finally started doing something that me, only me, has been asking for. Nobody else, so don't give yourself credit. You suck. This chapter introduced a new mechanic when it comes to storytelling in Star Rail, and that's perspective shifting. Now, if something is going on, I don't have to stare into the blank eyes of the Trailblazer at all times, but instead, I can stare into the eyes of Acheron as she reads from her book of wordy, overly intellectualized dialogue. But, we'll get into that. But I have to give credit where credit is due. What a great addition. Allowing us to control and see the perspective of the actual important characters in an arc is really refreshing, especially when it's characters like Aventurine, who I've got a lot to say about. But even though I've got a lot to say about, well, this entire chapter, what I have no notes on, though, is this presentation choice. And it, to me, has fundamentally changed the future of this game's storytelling to a massive degree. That it really needed to be the first thing that I talked about here. The second thing I really need to discuss is, well, the man of the hour, Aventurine. Star Rail has finally given us a character that is not only fleshed out, but also has, wait a minute, an arc? In all seriousness, Aventurine really is the best character in Star Rail, bar none. But let's summarize this chapter in a really quick recap to understand why that is. This chapter begins with the vast scene from last time. The Trailblazer meets up with his gang to figure out where to go from here. All the while, Acheron and Welt join up to wink at all the Honkai Impact the Third players in a weird C-plot. We'll get to that later. All the while, Aventurine gets called into a meeting with Sunday, where Sunday actually catches Aventurine in a lie, sending Aventurine on a hunt to figure out the truth of Robin's death, only for Aventurine to go on a quest of self-discovery, where he talks with his future and past self in a dream to come to terms with whether or not the gamble of life is even worth it. Turns out though, Aventurine was ahead of Sunday the whole time, and his plan goes off without a hitch, with him actually bringing in power stones from other IPC execs. But while this is going on, the Trailblazer goes to a bar, talks to a daddy. The daddy explains the entire plot as well as who the watchmaker is for some reason, when suddenly Aventurine comes on the TV to be like, don't come to school tomorrow, only for the cast to show up, fight him, that also be a part of his plan. He dies, but not really, and then Firefly is revealed to be alive too. So yeah, the quest has a lot thrown at the player, and really quickly, and we need to go over most of it. But first, let's talk about Aventurine. Aventurine's journey here is a really interesting one. From gambling his life away because he became used to the notion that life was a gamble, to slowly coming to terms with the value of his chip and that he really can continue on in a world as cruel as this one. It makes his definitely not death here a symbolic one, about getting to the abyss, a place where it feels like all hope is lost, and finding meaning in the nothingness. We come to learn that Aventurine has had, well, a rough life so far, to say the least. So much so that he's lost everyone he ever knew from his home planet, and it's essentially always gambling with life and death. It makes him come off as this devil-may-care character where whether he lives or dies isn't the issue, just that he wins. But the quest quickly flips this on its head, as when Aventurine talks to himself, we come to learn that this is more of a defense mechanism, and maybe even a lie. Aventurine really does care. He wants to carry on with life, but he also doesn't know why. So this spiritual journey that he goes on is his inner battle of what life is even about anyway. Aventurine encountering a self that he used to be, innocent and happy, as well as a cynical future self, was a great idea. I love that the dream aspect of Penacony is really pulling no punches when it comes to interesting uses of the dream context. I also really loved the little vignettes that we would get about Aventurine's life. It made it feel almost as if we were inside Aventurine's own head, viewing the scenes that have tortured him throughout his whole life. And they're great scenes too, from the origin of Aventurine's slave branding to his sister's death. We get some heartbreaking stuff. And what I really enjoy is the mention of essentially a god of luck guiding Aventurine. Now, I love the idea that we can interpret this in two ways. Maybe Aventurine really has survived all the turmoil in his life because he's being watched over by some god. But a more interesting way to look at it is that maybe all of that is just some fairy tale. Something that either Aventurine's people really believed because of their hardships, or something that his sister would tell him to make him feel better, to make him feel like everything that he's been through wasn't just pain for pain's sake, that there was a greater purpose. And Aventurine still grapples with this idea into his adulthood. His conversation with Acheron shows that he wants these answers, but all of his fighting has really cemented his true answer this whole time, but he's just now realizing it. It's beautiful stuff, really. I'm a sucker for when characters talk to themselves, and I'm a sucker for more outlandish ideas like talking to a different version of yourself in a dream while cursed with a mind virus. It's fun stuff. My major complaint here, though, is that this feels like this happens way too quickly. We barely knew Aventurine before this chapter, so this feels really quick. It feels like we came into this story 80% through it, and while there technically is an arc here, it feels a bit half-baked because we really didn't know him before this, so a change doesn't really mean a whole lot. But at the same time, it technically is an arc, so 10 out of 10, literally actually the best character they've ever made. Congratulations! But Maverick, I hear you ask. You said that you were conflicted about this chapter. If it has the best character in Hoyoverse history, and that character is developed in one chapter, then what are you conflicted about? Well, essentially everything else. Because while I talk about a character that I love in Aventurine, let's talk about a character that I really not love. No, don't love. Not loving is a gift for those who don't. Is probably what Acheron would say, because goddamn, she can never speak like a fucking person. Every scene with Acheron is what I've spoken about before, about Star Rail's weird dialogue writing at times, constant waxing poetically or speaking cryptically about some mega important philosophical point, or literally just how she went to the grocery store to pick up some milk, but she says it in some fuckery doodah way. I can't express enough how little the story has made me care about her character based on her presentation now. Let's be clear though, I'm not saying it's necessarily an unrealistic way of writing this character. I do believe that some characters in this world can just speak like robot poets if the writers want, but for a character that essentially represents the end of all things to be so unpersonable, uninteresting, and uninvolving is a really sad thing to see. And to have so much time dedicated to it feels like a waste to me. Where the arc excels in its character writing with Aventurine, it pushed all of its philosophical high horsery to Acheron. Her moments with Welt were not only annoying for the way that she speaks, but also the way that Hoyoverse is treating the Honkai Impact III connection. It's very clear, at every chance Hoyo gets, Hoyoverse wants to have their cake and eat it too about this relationship with their games. We have Welt, who is actually a Honkai Impact III character, but we also have Acheron, who's an equivalent to someone from his world. So obviously, while these characters are on the same world, they have to talk about it in the most obtuse and uninteresting way possible. Again, this conversation felt like a box that Hoyoverse just needed to tick, so they have Acheron and Welt leave the main party so that they could wink at the audience and say, hey, isn't this weird? And then do nothing else with it. I'm fully convinced at this point that the Honkai Impact connections in this game are not only wasted, but holding back certain characters. Who knows if we'll ever get interesting Welt content with the way that his Honkai Impact days are being treated. This conversation clearly only exists for the sake of fans of Impact III, which part of me thinks is fine, but the other part of me thinks that this does absolutely nothing for the actual plot of either the characters or the world that we're currently on. So to me, this conversation commits almost every sin. It's unengaging, obtuse, and pointless to the plot with boring, robotic, philosophical dialogue. I really didn't like the Welt and Acheron perspective here in this chapter. And if you noticed from my really quick recap earlier, the protagonist and the rest of the Astral Express crew is once again essentially doing nothing in this entire chapter's run. In actuality, their perspective not only felt like a B plot to the Aventurine stuff, it felt more like a D plot. D for dookie ass. Let's go over why I think this. In the previous video, I spoke about why I felt the Trailblazer was actually treated better at the beginning of this arc than honestly he'd ever been. With emotional ties to the plot based on what happened to Firefly, the arc fully had set up the Trailblazer on a mission, one that they adequately set up emotionally. Well, never mind all that, because not only did they reveal that Firefly is still alive here at the end of this chapter, they also did nothing with the death that we all knew was fake from the beginning. In the events of this arc, the Trailblazer experiences Firefly's death, goes on a run with Acheron and Mommy, then gets exposited to by Aventurine, only to then go talk to one person to have Gallagher then exposit again and tell the entire plot of the planet, and then he fights Aventurine and just meets Firefly again. This is an incredible, astronomical waste of a good plot. The Trailblazer and his side do absolutely nothing other than talk to one dude and fight one guy who attacked them between Firefly's death and her being revealed to be alive. Firefly's death should have been a catalyst for greater events, but instead it now just feels like a wet fart, as it quite literally led to nothing. But it begs the ultimate question: what was the point of Firefly's death? Since it was revealed so soon after, and since it didn't lead to any greater moments or extremes in the chapter, I'm not sure what the point of it was, other than just to be shocking. Wait a minute, we've seen this before. Now, I think the reveal that Firefly is Sam is actually not a bad one. It was telegraphed in the storytelling that we already had, and fans had been speculating that this was the case earlier because of the storytelling and color schemes, so it's not so much the idea itself that I don't like, it's in the execution. We don't know Sam, like, at all. So the reveal that Firefly is Sam is really just a reveal that Firefly is alive. That's it. The extra add-on that she's Sam is cool, but it does nothing for the player storytelling-wise. Think about if we had Sam on another planet before Penacony, and we got to know their character a little bit. Then Sam shows back up on Penacony after Firefly's death like we already have here. Then we learn that they're the same person later. Now that would be a good reveal, because by that point we would have already learned enough and gotten attached to both characters to think that they were separate people. So the reveal would be impactful when we learn that they're one and the same. Instead, this just feels hollow, and it feels like yet another story decision that was undercooked and rushed, just like Ting Yun, only so that the player base could be shocked for like 5 minutes. Honestly, this chapter should have just been the Aventurine stuff. It seems like they just wanted to make this chapter about him, which I honestly would have preferred, because every time we return to the Astral Express crew, the plot sullies what goodwill it had from the previous chapter. So the main character is back to square one, only solving the mystery for mystery's sake and no longer attached to the death of a would-be friend. But there's somehow an even bigger mistake that this portion of the chapter makes, and that's with Gallagher. Gallagher was a dude who we met like for 2 seconds in the opening chapter of this world, and it's clear now that they wanted to just say, the butler did it, and that's why Gallagher exists. The butler being the murderer is a cliche in mystery novels because it's a way for a writer to pretend that they did the groundwork for a mystery, only for it to be the thing that you forgot about from the beginning of the story. Gallagher was technically in the story for 2 seconds, so the story wants to have a gotcha moment when it's revealed that he had more to him than was initially thought. But like, okay. Gallagher could end up being literal God himself, and it would be just as shocking because we spent no time with him and got to know him 0%. Now, do I think that Gallagher is actually the villain here? Probably not. These authors seem intent on continuing to have twists and turns for twists and turns' sake, so I don't think he'll likely end up being the big bad, but what he did end up being here is a total party pooper. In my first video over this arc, I mentioned how one of the biggest mysteries was who the Watchmaker was, and if they even existed in the first place. And honestly, the game itself sets that up as a huge mystery too. Until Gallagher just says that it's Mikhail. In one of the most head-scratching plot reveals that Hoyoverse has ever done, in a random conversation with this guy that we barely know, he exposits to such an insane degree that it might actually end up being an arc-ruining conversation. He says that he used to be with the Watchmaker and that the Watchmaker is actually Mikhail, but that he's gone now. He also wants to tell us what everybody who's been paying attention would already know, that Clocky and the other mascots in the dream represent real people. I know Hoyoverse is typically pretty bad at reveals, and that's an upcoming video, but this really takes the cake on potentially the worst reveal ever, if this ends up being true. It's definitely possible that this watchmaker reveal ends up being a double bluff, and that the author just wants another gotcha moment by forcing this random conversation to happen, making us think one thing because it's explicitly stated, and then just doing another thing. But even if that's the case, that's a terrible way to do it. Overall, the Gallagher portion of this story may end up being the worst conversation in all of Star Rail, depending on how it pans out. And that's saying something. What was an actual good conversation though was Sunday and Aventurine. Sunday calls for a meeting with Aventurine, and in it, Sunday calls Aventurine out and essentially lays a curse on him. This conversation is great and really puts Aventurine into a tough spot and creates a lot of tension. Will Aventurine be able to solve the case of Robin's death before the timer runs out? It's actually a great setup for more investigating from an interesting character, but once again, the story kneecaps itself here. We come to learn that actually, Aventurine was always 2 steps ahead, and in the most anime move ever, he knew that they knew that he was bluffing. So then he doubled triple bluffs and was ahead of Sunday the whole time. And frankly, I have no clue why the authors chose to write this way. Maybe they wanted to show Aventurine as a really capable character, and they wanted to explain that all the hard times that he's went through has led him to become this master manipulator who always comes out on top. But like, wouldn't having him actually lose a battle for once and then come out on top prove this more? Having Aventurine actually get caught and then have to solve a way to come back out on top would have been really interesting and great to see, and tell us even more about his character in the process, because you would have to go through some conflict. Of course, Hoyoverse had to once again remove all tension and tell us in no uncertain terms that there was never really any doubt. Aventurine would get what he wants because he always knew what was going to happen. Again, this doesn't make the more introspective points of his story technically any worse, but it definitely does make the plot beats more boring and predictable, since we knew Aventurine was ahead of the curve with Sunday the whole time. So we, once again, comically, end this portion of the story with yet another death. Well, to be fair, a death. I say death because it's really unlikely that Sunday is actually dead. It feels like yet another fake out death. We already know that Firefly is alive, and since we have Robin as a pullable character in this next patch, it's likely that she is too. Again, we don't know on that. We're also fairly certain, based on how Aventurine exited, that he's also likely not dead. And we know that Ting Yun isn't dead either. This game is obsessed with fake deaths, to the point where I actually might prefer Genshin, in that at least Genshin just doesn't kill anyone off. So if Sunday doesn't die, that means that the game has done 4 different fake out deaths. And since Sunday and Robin's happened at the end of chapters, it's kind of super obvious at this point that they're just doing this because they want cliffhangers. So overall, I'm obviously pretty down on this chapter. What it does right is all in one character, Aventurine. And what it does wrong is with the storytelling of the arc as a whole, which is just a real shame. I'm excited for the next chapter, but mostly because I'm really interested to see what gotchas they think they're gonna have here now that the main mysteries have been jumbled to such an extent. So sadly, I think I'm gonna have to classify this chapter as off the rails. Some of you might think that that's too low, but some of you might think that that's way too high based on what I've been saying. But Aventurine stuff is really mostly great, and it's all here in just this chapter. It's just a shame that, well, everything else is pretty terrible in my opinion. But where would you place this? I'm really curious to hear what you think in the comments. Regardless though, thank you so much for watching, and if you're a Patreon supporter, thank you even more for watching. You're the best. Also, since you made it to the end of the video, here's a mech suit, so you can never die. Oh, that's pretty cool, right? All right. You can go now.